sprang out of the post-World War II wave, my generation, and yours, you're younger than me, most of you, has back and at the Ukrainian experience in Canada and has said, my God, there are these blank pages, to use Gorbachev's phrase, in Ukrainian-Canadian history. And one of the most important ones is, in my mind, the Ukrainian experience of internment during Canada's first national internment operations, which were held between 1914 and 1920. Now, the first point you have to get in your minds is that World War I started in 1914 and ended in 1918, whereas the internment operations lasted until 1920. So, although we sometimes refer to this as the First World War period internment operations, in fact, some Ukrainians and other East Europeans were kept interned until 1920, several years after the war's end. First important point. Now, why were they interned in the first place? Well, just as most of our parents came from Halachina, Galicia, in the English nomenclature, or Bukovina, so too most of the Ukrainian pioneers who were attracted to Canada by government propaganda and various travel agents and so on, boosting the idea of coming to Canada, most of those people were attracted to Canada given the sense that if they came here from Halachina and Bukovina, they would be given 160 acres of free or nearly free land. All they had to do was work it. So between 1891 and 1914, approximately, the figures could be debated somewhat, but approximately 171,000 Ukrainians came to Canada, settling at first primarily in the prairie provinces, that is, primarily in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And after 1905, some of those people coming and settling in north-central Ontario, in the mining and lumbering camps, and also in the manufacturing centers of southern Ontario and adjacent Quebec. So up to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, you have approximately 171,000 Ukrainians coming, attracted to Canada by pro-immigration government-financed propaganda, settling in Canada. Now, most of those people come, as I say, from Galicia and Bukovina, Halachina and Bukovina. They come carrying Austro-Hungarian passports, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled that part of Western Ukraine, so anyone leaving there came bearing an Austro-Hungarian passport. Very few people who came to Canada before the outbreak of World War I came from the Tsarist Empire, from so-called Velika Ukraine. Fine. They come into Canada, pioneer the West, work in the mineral extraction, resource industries, the timber industry, and so on, manufacturing industry. The war breaks out, and what does Canada do? Canada, a colony or a dominion of the British Commonwealth, the British Empire, joins the British side against Austro-Hungary and against Germany, against the so-called Central Powers. As a result, the government of Canada, by order in council, Canadian government cabinet, proclaims that all citizens of Germany and Austro-Hungary are declared to be enemy aliens. The same thing happened, of course, in World War II, exactly the same thing with Japanese Canadians. And it was done using the same legislative act, namely the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act of 1914 was proclaimed in 1914, and its principal victims were Canadians of Ukrainian origin. Why? Because if you look at the statistics, and they're not perfect, and they're uneven, and we have to try to sort out other East European groups, Slovenes, Slovaks, Jews, Poles, and others, Bulgarians, some Turks, and so on. But basically, the largest population group from Austro-Hungary to be living in Canada at the time were people who came from Halachina and Bukovina, most of whom were Ukrainians. Just over 8,500 people, most of them young, single men, were interned, that is, imprisoned in 26 camps across the country. Those camps are more commonly referred to as internment camps, But in the literature of the day, they're actually called concentration camps. A wonderful propaganda word for us to use, as you can imagine. 26 concentration camps spread right across the country. And if you look in the booklet you have in front of you, there's a map showing you the location of those camps. Some were located in the maritime region, and they tended to house prisoners of war, genuine German sailors, Austrian Germans, merchant marine men, Navy personnel captured in battle and interned. No doubt about it. And I'll show you a slide in a few moments that shows you actually German POWs in Halifax in one of the camps. But if you look again, you'll see that there were other camps established in north-central Quebec and in Ontario and in the Prairie provinces. And tomorrow morning, you'll actually go to Castle Mountain Camp, where some 9,000 men were interned, of whom 9,000 or 900, I can't remember at any rate, but most of whom were Austro-Hungarians, quote-unquote, namely Ukrainians. Now, 26 camps spread across the country, about 8,500 people interned. We estimate, and it's a guesstimate, to be very honest, that about 5,000 of those, given the population structure of Canada at the time, were of Ukrainian origin. There were also Jews, Poles, Slovenes, Bulgarians, Slovaks, Croatians, Serbs, and others, Russians even. No doubt about it. We should never, and you should never tell anyone that it was all just Ukrainians. There were genuine Germans interned, genuine prisoners of war, but there were also a large number of civilian internees. Important point. Second point you have to keep in mind. The government also established, through order in council, registration procedures, established registrars of enemy aliens in major cities right across the country. And as a result, between 80 and 88,000 people living in Canada were designated enemy aliens and were forced to carry, in fact, internal kind of passports. If they wanted to move from where they lived to another location or travel or visit relatives or friends or what have you, they had to report their movements and they had to report their whereabouts on a bi-weekly or monthly basis. So in fact, a kind of internal passport system was established after 1914, and this affected at least half of the Ukrainian population in Canada. Now, I'm sometimes told, well, yes, War Measures Act, the same act used against Japanese Canadians, and yes, some were interned, and yes, they were put in these camps scattered all over Canada in some very difficult conditions that I'll say something about in a moment. But there was no racism involved. After all, the Japanese are yellow and you're white. And you hear that, and you have to be prepared to answer that. Well, the point surely is that the skin color shouldn't matter, but even if you say that it does, you have to argue and point out to people that in those days, you were all bohunks. You were garlic eaters. You dressed differently than the average Anglo-Celtic Canadian, than the average Anglo-Canadian. You spoke a different language. You were settled in block settlements throughout the prairies and so on. So in those days, whereas you walking down the street of Calgary or Toronto or Halifax or wherever you come from are indistinguishable from other Canadians, in those days, Ukrainians were an identifiable, visible minority. And so there was, it's very clear that there was a great deal of discrimination against Canadians of Ukrainian and other Eastern European Slavic origins. So don't let them put you off by saying, well, yes, it was a racist thing in World War II against Japanese Canadians, that's why we have to apologize, whereas against Ukrainians it was something different. It wasn't. Don't forget that. There used to be editorials in the Winnipeg Tribune in the late 1890s and in the early 1900s called Galicians versus White Men. There was a French-Canadian priest called Father Morin that wrote in 1899, as for the Galicians, the general opinion in the West is that the Galicians are 10 times lower on the scale of civilization than even the Indians. There was an enormous amount of racial or racist prejudice against Ukrainians in those days, and that fueled the internment process. Now, it wasn't just internment of, say, 5,000 or 4,500 Ukrainians that we have to worry about. It wasn't just the registration of 80 to 88,000 Ukrainian Canadians and restrictions that were consequently placed upon their freedom of association and mobility, all things we now hold dear. There were other measures that were taken against them that were equally traumatic and difficult to bear. For example, properties and valuables were confiscated by the custodian of enemy alien properties. And we know that not all those properties and valuables were returned. We know that some of them were stolen. A few weeks ago in Toronto, I spoke to a man called Mike Branson. Branson, nice Anglo-Saxon name. Well, his name was actually Brzezinski or something like that. He told me his father's name was. His father had changed his name because in 1916 he'd been interned. He'd had gold coins on him when he was interned. In 1918, he'd been given a receipt, quote unquote. In 1918, he was paroled. He pulled out his receipt at the Kapuskasing camp and said, "Here's my receipt, return my gold coins, return my property." A corporal took a gun, rammed it in his jaw, broke his jaw and said, there's your money, now get out. Now, the father died saying that the Canadian system raped me economically. The son is bitter. The son was a veteran of World War II, and I'm sure he was in the front of the cenotaph in Toronto today on Remembrance Day. And we have to remember that Canadians served. About 10,000 Ukrainian Canadians served in World War I. About 35 to 40,000 served in World War II. Our war record is nothing to be ashamed of compared to other Canadians. In fact, one Ukrainian Canadian who disguised himself as a Russian, Philippe Konoval, won the Victoria Cross in World War I. So nothing to be ashamed about our war record. But there is something to be ashamed about when you start thinking about the confiscation of properties and valuables that were never returned. We know, based on archival research that we've just started to do, and it's tentative and it isn't complete, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have all the answers, but at least $32,000 in pocket change, that is if I interned you all right now and took all the money from you and doled it out to you as an allowance bit by bit while you were in the camps for cigarettes and chocolates and the rest of it. At least $32,000 was left at the end of the internment period in 1920. That money today is worth $1.3 million in conservative terms. That says nothing about properties or other valuables that were confiscated. So our community, not only the individuals who were interned, but the community as a whole suffered an enormous material loss. We're still calculating it. I haven't got a figure. I can't say 15 million. I can't say $250 million like the National Association of Japanese Canadians recently did and got. All I can say is money and properties and valuables were confiscated. Recently in the Winnipeg Free Press, a so-called community activist who knows nothing about the issue said that no properties and valuables were confiscated. Take a look in the booklet, and I quote, I think it's on page 19, General Otter, who you'll see his picture in a little while, General Otter in his final report says that properties and valuables were confiscated. So don't let any Anglo-Saxon or any Ukrainian say, well, to nas ne porušilo, nikto ničo ne zabral. Nonsense. They took it. And they took property, they took valuables, to say nothing about freedom. What price you put on that, I don't know. But as well, General Otter, the commandant in charge of the entire internment operation procedures, himself wrote private correspondence that he was worried that he would be held legally responsible for all the valuables that were being stolen from internees as they were being interned. We also know that the people who were interned suffered as a result of having their labor exploited. Let me give you a fine example. From southern Alberta, Frank, Alberta, coal mining area. In those days, coal miners working a full day shift made about $2, $2.25 an hour. We have one case that we recently discovered of a whole group of Ukrainian coal miners, very clearly called Ukrainians, working in Frank, Alberta, 4 o'clock shift. They went down in the mine at $2.25 a day. Before they'd gone down, they'd said to the manager, we would like a raise. We'd like to now make, I think it was $2.50 a day. In those days, good money. They came up at 4 o'clock, end of shift. Manager was standing there with mounted police, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police in those days, today's RCMP. They were all interned as dangerous foreigners and subversives. 1 month later, the same 25 Ukrainian Canadians were brought back to the same mine, to the same shift. You know what they were paid? 25 cents a day. We know from the archival evidence that remains that major Canadian corporations, CN Rail, CP Rail, Abitibi Pulp and Paper, Algoma Steel, International Harvester, benefited from exploiting internee labor. It's not a debate. We know they did that. Other indignities are heaped on top of this. In 1917, the Canadian government, the first election after the outbreak of the war, passed something known as the the Wartime Elections Act of 1917. The Wartime Elections Act disenfranchised, that is, took away the vote from anyone who had come into Canada from March of 1902 on, which effectively meant that most Ukrainian Canadians, by then naturalized Canadian citizens, had no right to vote, had no right to protest against the measures that were being taken against them. Convenient. Women didn't vote then. So if you figure that 170,000 Ukrainians, and women are roughly half, in effect, they took the vote away from everyone that could have voted. Okay? 1918, the fledgling left-wing Ukrainian movement, the Ukrainian Social Democratic Party, which arose in reaction to events in Canada and events in the homeland, Bolshevik Revolution and so on, was declared illegal and suppressed, as were its newspapers. The Ukrainian language press in Canada was censored through the entire period and eventually suppressed. There were deportations. And of course, in the whole process, there were also people being ripped out of their communities and interned and so on. Now, was all this necessary? Well, no. There is no evidence that I found, none that the government has produced to convince me otherwise, that there was any internal security threat. Just as in the Japanese case, where Canadians of Japanese heritage were interned because of their Japanese origins, there was no security threat proven ever. The same thing in the Ukrainian-Canadian case. There was no internal security threat. And in fact, one of the most damning pieces of evidence, which is not in the booklet, was found in London, and I'll tell you why it had to be found in London in a moment. And it was this. In January of 1915, within a few months of the war breaking out, the British government, the Foreign Office, 10 Downing Street, where Maggie lives now, wrote a letter to the Governor-General of Canada. And the exact same letter, incidentally, was sent to the Governor-General of Newfoundland, which was not a province until 1949. So this, they informed the colonies. They informed, through the Governor-General, the Government of Canada, that Ruthenians, i.e. Ukrainians, should be given preferential treatment as friendly aliens, because they are, in point of fact, hostile to Austro-Hungarian rule. So the Canadian government knew that Ukrainians, Slovaks, Slovenes, and others were friendly aliens, not enemy aliens. They knew that they should be given preferential treatment. And what did they do? Instead, they established concentration camps, interned people, disenfranchised them, deported them, busted up families, forced them to register as enemy aliens, and discriminated against them in a whole number of other ways. So they knew. If you'd asked me 2 or 3 years ago, frankly, why did this happen? I would have said it was all a colossal mistake. When in this knowledge, I'll tell you Ukrainian, Slovakia, and all the rest of it. But they knew then, and we've uncovered the evidence to prove it. 2 more points on the argument, on the case. We're sometimes told that, well, these weren't Canadians, these were immigrants. They weren't really Canadians, and so what happened to them is, sure, it's wrong, it's unfortunate, and so on, but they weren't really Canadians. Well, the best we can determine, in those days, if you came into Canada and you settled and you worked the land for 3 years, you were naturalized. You became naturalized, became a Canadian. And eventually they increased that to 5 years. But the best we can determine, that Professor John Hurd Thompson has suggested that 60% of those affected by these various kinds of repressive legislations were in fact Canadian citizens. And in the booklet I quote a man called Nick Hunamod, interned near Halifax, who says the following. He says, look, I've been in Canada for 7 years. I married a Canadian-born woman. I homesteaded in Alberta. And I even tried to register myself with a battalion being formed in Edmonton. And you interned me. Here's a naturalized Canadian citizen, homesteader, who wants to fight for Canada, and he gets interned. So don't let anyone tell you that, these weren't Canadians, this was some kind of mistake. It wasn't a mistake. And they did it to naturalized Canadian citizens. Important points to remember. Okay? Don't forget that, because sometimes you hear people saying, well, these are immigrants or these are people coming in, they're not naturalized. Nonsense. A large number, we're not exactly sure how many, were naturalized citizens. Now, you've heard me already say several times, question mark, we're not sure, this is an estimate, da-da-da-da-da. Why? Well, simply because we have now proven, based on the archival research of myself and a friend of mine called Leonard Luciuk, no relation, in the United States, in the archives down in Washington, and Bohdan and Kordan's research here in Alberta and in the National Archives in Ottawa, that the Canadian government deliberately destroyed most of the archival record, not all of it, most of the archival record was destroyed in the 1950s. So the other day I'm sitting there with the Minister of Multiculturalism, Mr. Wiener, and Mr. Fournier, the assistant, or the Deputy Minister for Multiculturalism, and the Assistant Deputy Minister, Wolf Serafini. We're all sitting around. They say, well, you people have to do more research. Have to make a stronger case. Well, how do you expect us, a small community with limited resources, to do research when we have proven that the government of Canada destroyed the archives? What is it we're asking the federal government for? 5 things. Of course. The first thing, and the most important thing, and this is what you should stress when you talk to friends who aren't Ukrainian, other people in the world. We're asking that the federal government, that the government of Canada, acknowledge that a wrong was done to Canadians of Ukrainian origin and other East Europeans between 1914 and 1920. We're not asking them to apologize, and be real careful of that word, because I cannot, in my mind, justify asking someone in 1988 to apologize for what a government did in 1914 or 1917 or 1920. What we're asking for is that the government of Canada formally acknowledge that what happened to Canadians of Ukrainian origin and other East Europeans in this country, many of them naturalized citizens, was wrong, unjust, and unwarranted. Point 1. Second point is that we're asking the government of Canada to establish at all those campsites where Ukrainian Canadians and other East Europeans were interned, historical plaques through the Parks Branch or what have you, which would inform visitors to those sites or people who drive by that this happened. Because in the history textbooks that you read in your high school studies and so on, there is virtually no mention of this. You can read Mel Hurtick's New Encyclopedia of Canada or what have you, not a mention. And what we want to do is make sure that that episode is not forgotten. And what we've also asked, and sort of tossed this one in the last moment because it sounded neat, we've asked the government to actually reconstruct the Castle Mountain site that you're going to be visiting tomorrow as a kind of open-air living museum, a permanent, realistic reminder of what went on. The third point is that we're asking the government of Canada to amend the Emergencies Act. Now you're sitting there going, what the hell is the Emergencies Act? Well, the War Measures Act, that was passed in 1914, that was used to intern enemy aliens between 1914 and 1920, the principal victims of that were the Ukrainians, was used again in 1941 against Japanese Canadians, and in 1970 against the Quebecois during the so-called Quiet Revolution. That act, the War Measures Act, has now been abolished, and a new act has been put in its place called the Emergencies Act, 1988, by Mr. Beattie. We were asked, or we made submissions rather, to the legislative committee that was debating this legislation before it was brought up for final reading before the House of Commons. And our point was, look, you have to ensure that nothing like what happened in 1914 or 1941 or 1970 happens again. And incidentally, in that sense, we were supported by the National Association of Japanese Canadians. Because what the Emergencies Act does is it does not prohibit the internment of Canadians, Canadian civilians, should they hold dual citizenship. Now you might be saying, oh God, this is very arcane. What's all this about? What's this guy talking about? Here's the point. In 1978, the Soviet Union passed a Citizenship Act and made anyone who came from or was born in that territory that now comprises the Soviet Union a Soviet citizen, and their descendants. So I was born in Kingston, Ontario, but my parents are post-war immigrants, like most of you in this room. And as a result, I, despite the fact that I was a Canadian citizen and don't want to be a Soviet citizen, I have dual citizenship. I'm standing before you as a Canadian and a Soviet citizen. You know, you could say, oh, well, so some guy in Moscow passes a rule, who cares? In 1914, those Ukrainians who came to settle the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or to work in the mining and lumber camps of north-central Ontario and the manufacturing centers of southern Ontario and Quebec, they came here to live in Canada and make Canada their homes. They were naturalized, many of them. And yet they were interned. Why were they interned? Because they were quote-unquote Austro-Hungarian citizens. So what are you going to do when the next war rolls around, God forbid, and let's say it's a conventional war? You know, we always talk about nuclear war, but what if there's a conventional war in Europe, and the government kind of looks around and says, and if it does, it will notice that there are nearly 1 million Canadians, Jews, Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, you name it, who are Soviet citizens. And if you think that's odd or unrealistic or naive, well, you've got 1914, 1941, and 1970 to make you think otherwise. But if you still think it's odd, all you have to do is look at the Emergency Planning Act for the federal government of Canada, which provides, and I've got a copy, provides for the establishment of internment camps in Baffin Island. I'm not into Wales. You know, you've got to be very conscious of this, because the Emergencies Act now provides for measures exactly the same in kind to those of 1914, 1941, or 1970. And most of you in this room are going to be affected by it. Now, you can sit back and say, aha, but we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms now, I'll be protected. Guess again, folks, the Emergencies Act that we want to have amended actually has a charter override provision. So with a stroke of the pen, some bureaucrat in Ottawa can say, and you can be interned. And that's spooky. And that's one of the things that the Japanese Canadian community and we are like that on. Point 4. Cook has asked for a grant from the federal government of $563,000. Doesn't two projects. $200,000 allocated to an independent, i.e. non-Ukrainian, private firm, public accounting firm of some sort, which would do an economic impact assessment study of the costs to our community of these internment measures. You remember the National Association of Japanese Canadians hired Price Waterhouse, based in Winnipeg, to do a study. What they did was actually take 4 Japanese Canadian families and extrapolate, and they came up with a $250 million figure. $163,000 to do additional archival research, partially to fuel the economic impact assessment, and publish a documentary collection, another small booklet or 2 in English and French on this issue, so that if at minimum our message gets out all across Canada, so that this issue is taught in curricula across the country in high schools and universities, so that these little booklets, which incidentally was sent to each public library in Canada and to all the MPs and all the senators and about 10,000 Ukrainian Canadian households, is all over the place so that people know about this. And it's working. I mean, without even that support so far, without that money, We have not had one negative editorial in Canada. We've had minor sort of, you know, the Ottawa Sun the other day said, well, we shouldn't give them money, but we should acknowledge it was wrong was done. I mean, we haven't had a completely negative editorial, is what I'm saying. There's been a great deal of sympathy from within the sort of national news media. Now, what is point 5? And here's the critical thing. We've asked for acknowledgement, historical markers, reconstruction. We've asked for amendments to the Emergencies Act. We've asked for a limited amount of funding to do an independent impact study and a historical research. But point 5 is a critical one. We haven't gone to the government and said, give us 50 million or 10 million or 15 million, whatever. We've gone and said, small amount, $500,000 roughly, to do research over the next year and a half, so that by 1991, the centennial of Ukrainian settlement in Canada, we will all know what the costs were, what the true story is, and all its complexity, and so that by 1991, the beginning of the second century of Ukrainian settlement in Canada, we will resolve this issue. We want to fill in this blank page in Ukrainian-Canadian history, in Canadian history as a whole, and we want to resolve the issue with the government so that when we go into the second century, all that's behind us. Now that may mean Price Waterhouse or whoever we hire may come back and say, well, the economic cost of the community, the impact on the community was $50. May come out and say 50 billion. We're willing to say, from our point of view, let an independent, outside, reputable public accounting firm determine what the costs were. And let our researchers based within the community publish and do some more work on this. But government, if you accept this 5-plank proposal, you agree with us that by 1991, we will resolve this issue on the basis of the results of that economic study and of our researchers. And that's fair. That's not a quick fix, as I would have preferred, if you asked me personally, but it's a rational, moderate, very modest proposal. But if we were to achieve even the same that the Japanese-Canadian community did, our monetary needs to do the kinds of things that I think are important, putting scholarships in universities for people who are interested in Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian studies, putting scholarships into universities connected to the chair or the institute or UCDC or KUK to send people to Ukraine, putting scholarships into universities to buy books on Ukrainian subjects, putting scholarships in the community to have sponsor conferences like this, fellowships for graduate studies, for postdoctoral studies, and so on. I mean, unless we build that up, you know, and I'm sometimes told, and I'm going to sort of end this on 2 points, I'm sometimes told, you know, that you did this, that you did that. They earned it. They worked very, very, very hard. And if you want to talk to me about the Deschênes Commission and what my experiences there were, we can talk about that some other time. But the point is, you know, our community has an incredible chance right now on this issue because of the political and moral climate that the Japanese-Canadian settlement achieved to push. Don't talk to them about dissidents. Don't talk to them about multiculturalism and all that crap. Talk to them about a real issue that we got them by the short and curlies on. And on this one, if we win this, we can create an infrastructure in our community that'll blow the socks off anybody. Last point. Keep hearing, you know, few survivors, this and that and the other. The RCMP had an informant, a guy called Mikhailo Petrovsky, Nash. I met him before he died. I never knew what he was when I was talking to him. But Mike Petrovsky was an informant, really, a special constable is a classy word for it, within the community. And when KUK was being created in 1940 by the federal government, Petrovsky went to the first KUK Congress, 43. And he had this to write. He said, even many of the Ukrainian-Canadian leaders are, quote, still in fear of the barbed wire fence. So 20 years after the last internment camp was shut down, Ukrainian-Canadian leaders in the community were still in fear of the barbed wire fence. And if you think that that was just a Petrovsky, you know, one man's opinion, you look, there's another document that we've uncovered written by OSS, Office of Strategic Service Officers from the United States, forerunner of the CIA, written in 1944, and that document said, quote, the Ukrainian community in Canada is still suffering under the handicap of its experiences of internment in World War I. So this was a traumatic experience. This was a negative experience, and it had long-lasting impacts. Most of us have never heard about it because, like one internee that I interviewed 2 weekends ago in Winnipeg said to me, once you've been burned, you don't want to get burned again. You stay away from fire. Our community was terrorized, it was victimized, and the survivors of that didn't talk much about it. And of course, most of our parents never knew about it, so we can't blame them for not telling us. The ones that knew about it were too afraid to talk about it, for the most part. It created a left wing, it gave impetus to a left wing in our community that probably would never have been as strong as it was if it hadn't been for those internment operations. They were unnecessary, they were unjust, and they were unwarranted. And we've got to, I mean, you've got to go back to your communities and explain that to them.
They saw the Banff National Park, the Dominion Parks, as a logical site, and in June 1915 they sent out a scouting mission, and a site was subsequently selected. The site was originally 2 kilometers north of here, but a district medical officer commissioned by internment operations in Ottawa was sent out and deemed the site inappropriate. Why it was inappropriate was because under royal warrant and Hague conventions that you had to have a number of things in place: adequate water, facilities, sewage, so on and so forth, just for the general hygiene of prisoners and troops. So the site that was subsequently selected is the site that you're now standing on. The site is approximately 200 feet away from the road. There was a clearing. They cleared much of the work around here. It's about 200 feet away from the CPR tracks, which is just to just behind us. It's actually west. Orienting yourself, this is north, east, west, south. The road itself was simply a coach road, and the initial reasoning behind putting the camp at this particular site, or rather further up and here later, was to push the road to Lake Louise. This was the terminus point of the road, and during the period of 1915, the entire course of the 6 months that remained in 1915, they constructed the road all the way to Lake Louise. They also, under the supervision of the park superintendent, S.J. Clark, cleared site the 20 feet away from the CPR railway tracks for the purpose of having tourists being able to see wildlife. So the CPR tracks from Banff all the way to Lake Louise were cleared approximately 20 feet to 30 feet on either side of the railway tracks. There are other projects that they were engaged in. Logging, clearing dead timber. Another reason behind clearing a lot of the timber from the railway tracks was because the locomotives were still operating on coal. You had sparks flying, and they wished to reduce the fire hazard in the national parks. But they were also put on a series of other projects as well. Among those projects were, in the wintertime, the camp was relocated to Cavan Basin. The Cavan Basin, if you are at all familiar with Banff, is located about 1 mile west of the village of Banff proper. And there, in 1986, the Canadian government engaged Parks Canada to reconstruct the Cavan Basin site, but that show rather distinctly the layout of that particular campsite. Now, during the winter time, the reasoning for relocating the prisoners was because of the extreme harsh climate in this area. In 1915, the camp still remained until December, and they relocated in January of 1916. And in Banff, they worked on the Cavan Basin site itself, working on the pool. 1914, Banff Springs Hotel burnt down. You had the hotel being reconstructed. The foundations were built of a stone that was quarried approximately 6 kilometers away from the Banff Springs, and internment labor was used to hew the rock out of the cliff. if you go to Banff, you will be able to follow the Spray River, and you'll see a huge face of a cliff, and it's rather smooth. And the smooth face of the cliff is where they blew rock out of the face of the cliff, carved it out into huge blocks, and this was later hauled off to the construction site at Banff Springs Hotel, and you had Scottish stonemasons that actually quarried the rock into whatever shape they required it. But the initial hard labor was done by internment. They also built the Banff Springs golf course. They built various bridges in the vicinity of Banff.
A number of other projects that they were engaged in were the clearing of what is still now known as the buffalo paddocks. If you go along Highway 1 outside of Banff, you'll see this huge clearing. There's very young growth. Well, largely all that site was cleared for the purpose of housing buffalo. Much of the buffalo was later rounded up and taken to Wainwright and later up to Buffalo National Park in northern Alberta. What else could I say? A number of other projects, as I say, were engaged by internment labor. Now, this site, initially in 1915, housed the prisoners from Lethbridge. In total, about 100 to 120. There were 50 troops. Now, there was considerable breakouts in the initial stages of the internment camp. I think from June to October or November, there were 28 internees that escaped. Only 2 were caught, and 26 remained at large and were never caught. The majority of them went across to the BC side of the border. There was apparently in Revelstoke a lumber company that was managed by a Ukrainian, and documentation in the public archives indicates that this fellow assisted Ukrainians who actually escaped from this camp and tried to provide access and, of course, refuge to these individuals who later made it to the American border. Again, the whereabouts of these individuals and what happened to them, there is no information, but presumably a lot of them escaped to the U.S., which at that time was not part of the conflict. This is the main camp. As I say, a secondary camp was set up, and it was permanently at the quarry site, and they were working on this 12 months of the year. The camp, June 1915, was set up. It was dismantled in August of 1917. Late 1916, early 1917, as it became fairly clear and evident that because of debates that were occurring within Ottawa itself proper, as well as there was some indication that not all of these individuals should be interned, and in fact it was not to the benefit of the Canadian government to have these people located in a camp proper. A lot of them were paroled, and they were paroled to a series of companies, and the companies included such things as the Brewster Transport Company here in Banff. They were paroled on their own recognizance, but they had to report to the local RCMP detachment and local police forces every week, indicating that their contract with that company was still held. Brewster Transport Company, Algoma Steel, Abitibi Pulp and Paper Company, Harvester International, a series of major corporations all benefited and profited from internment labor. Again, the labor was not, and the payment for labor was such that it was not provided on a free market system. These people were pegged at a certain wage scale and were obliged to work at that wage scale. There are a number of instances, documentation showing, for instance, that I think it was in 1915, I think it was in Frank, a mining company. The mine manager was having difficulty with a whole shift. The shift were Ukrainians by and large. They walked off work at 4 o'clock. He had reported them as Bolsheviks. The RCMP came in, rounded them all up, hauled them to camp, and then the mining company subcontracted, or rather the Canadian government subcontracted that labor to the same company at a rate of pay that was considerably lower than they were engaged in as laborers in a open labor market. Again, as I say, 1 month later they were back on the same shift, but working for considerably less money. Difficult all the way around, not only in terms of the internees, but also the guards themselves. This was considered a hardship posting. There were those who went AWOL. They were subsequently caught. A number of these characters were brought up before military tribunals. 2 such soldiers, in fit of despondency, after being here for 2 years, committed suicide, if only because of the harshness of the climate. They perhaps had some reservations about what they were doing. And if you go into the Union Cemetery in Banff, you will find 2 grave sites, and the 2 soldiers, Privates Grindley and Beardsley, are now buried in the Union Cemetery. There were a number of deaths at this site of internees. Now, it's a very interesting question. What has happened was that as prisoners of war under the Hague Convention, they were to be given a proper burial as nationals of a state at war with Canada. Now, when they had died, the internment officer wrote to Ottawa, and the director of internment operations indicated that the operations would not pay for the burial of these individuals. And when correspondence was directed to the Department of Justice, the Department of Justice said that they would have nothing to do with it as well. And it was incumbent upon those at the site to make arrangements for burial. And there is very little in the way of documentation, but presumably what has happened is that they simply hauled these people off the site and buried them outside of the perimeters of the camp. There are a number of man-made mounds. Again, this is all speculation, but again, only archaeological dig will ascertain whether, in fact, these are burial sites or not. Yes.
So these people, they were buried at the Union grave site, and then they're...
No, these were soldiers,
okay.
And they were given military burial. But as nationals of another country at war with Canada, and under the legal term as prisoners of war, those internees who died at the site were to be given the same honor. Now, if you go to the Union Cemetery in Banff, you will not find similar burial grounds or an entombment site for these internees. And again, as I say, if you look around, you'll find a number of man-made mounds, which can probably, one could speculate, but I imagine they are burial sites.
The general campsite, we have here the stockade. The stockade was divided into 2 sections. On the westerlymost part, there was a cook's mess. There was a hospital tent, if I'm not mistaken, to the right. The stockade was right here.
What exactly is the stockade?
The stockade was a clearing, and it was encompassed by a wired fence that was 15 feet high. If you look at some of the photographs, extant photographs, you'll find that on a spacing of every 20 feet or so, you'd have a placard, and it would be basically saying that there should be no attempt to cross the fence, otherwise they would be shot. You'll find that there's considerable clearing beyond the campsite, and that was for the guards to have. It would be described as a free fire zone. Those who crossed the barbed wire were in that zone were able to, after first warning, were subject to being shot. Now, the stockade is right here. There were 2 large tents. At any particular time, there were 657 individuals who were interned at this site. The largest contingent, late 1915, early 1916, 436 individuals were interned, 2 large camps, so it's approximately 220 individuals per tent. We have here on the southerly section, we have a series of tents, and you'll see these little stones outlining the perimeters of the tents. 150 soldiers were located. part of the 103rd Calgary Rifles. Beyond the tents was a cookhouse. You'll find, an open pit, and that's presumably where a lot of the fine cuisine was was doled out. Opposite you to behind was the orderly room. The orderly room. There was also the officers' quarters. There was the tent for the commanding officer, a gentleman by the name of Major Duncan Stewart, who subsequently went over and became a major with a division in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. His position was subsequently taken over by a Captain Spencer. Major Stewart also brought along his family. So Mrs. Stewart, in fact, entertained residents from the village of Banff. And what you found was many of the photographs that we have were provided by the Alpinist Club of Banff, and very much in keeping with Victoriana tradition and curiosos. If you go into Banff, you'll find a museum where you have these taxidermied heads of rams and the like. Well, this was very much in keeping with that sort of psychology of looking at peculiarities, and clearly the internees that were located in this camp wore peculiarities of sorts, and you found every once in a while, every 3 or 4 months, a motor car with tourists would come by and examine the campsites and break bread and have tea with Mrs. Stewart and Major Stewart. Again, over here there was a hoosgow, and to the right, and again you'll find some of these stones. The stones that in fact outline this particular construction. And what it was is a solitary confinement cell. The solitary confinement cell was such that individuals who were considered malingerers, who were considered who were recalcitrant, who were just plain uncooperative, were usually
to the confinement cell for a duration of 14 to 21 days. They had various scales of punishment in terms of the diet, and the majority of it was 1 pound of bread and water per day. And there was a secondary scale which was 8 ounces of bread and water. Now the diet for the internees themselves was such that they, in general, had 1 pound of meat, 1 1/4 pound of bread, and 3 ounces of vegetables. Much of the provisions were supplied by subcontract to various companies that were located in Banff. Sea Freeze Company, etc. It's a Dave White Company, a very prominent individual within the Banff local community. So the conditions of the camp were very, very harsh. There's no doubt about it. And by any stretch of the imagination, I think that it's necessary to read maybe perhaps some of the documentation. Because it's appropriate. Again, can I have that sequence of documents that is going about? There's some were sent to his wife by N. Olynyk, prisoner number 898. I'm glad to have received your welcome letter. I'm very glad to hear from you that you are back from hospital and that you are in better health, though you say that you are very weak. I believe, but I cannot help you. As you know yourself, there are men running away from here every day because the conditions here are very poor, so that we cannot go on much longer. We are not getting enough to eat. We are very hungry. We are as hungry as dogs. They are sending us to work as they don't believe us, and we are very weak. Things are not good. The weather has changed for some time past and is wet and muddy. Also in the tents in which we sleep, everything is wet. We get up at 5 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. Such conditions we have here in Canada. I will never forget. Men have escaped from here. 28 now. Nick Mudre ran away yesterday. You might tell his wife, but I must wait till the end because I have been here for 10.5 months already, so that I don't wish to lose the money I have earned here. My dear wife, please try to find somebody to help you because you are not able to go to work. I'm sure you are very weak, and I would advise you to write a letter to the camp commandant asking for support. And if they refuse to give it to you, ask them to release me when I could support you as you need. I have nothing else to write to you, only to wish you better health. I think when he's talking about the conditions of the camp, I think we can take it at face value. There are those who, in fact, would scoff at this. And, in fact, the camp commandant who had intercepted the letter in response to other such complaints that were smuggled out by internees here, apparently on the way to work sites in camp, some of the internees would send a note or a letter and forward it on to a passerby in the village of Banff and ask that it be posted. And what you find is that the complaints were brought to the attention of the American consular official in Calgary, who acted on behalf of the interests of of Germany and Austro-Hungary, and the complaints were registered with the Canadian government. And when the General Otter, who was the commanding officer of internment operations, brought it to the attention of the internment camp officer, that is Major Stewart dismissed this as all frivolous. And yet we find here correspondence that was directed by Major Stewart to a number of senior officers, that is of the military district number 13 of Alberta, indicating that the conditions were indeed harsh, not simply for the internees, but for his troops as well, and that much of the internees were were rather working in nothing but rags, and that he was himself ashamed to call a roll call of the internees because much of them simply appeared in their underwear and nothing else. Again, the campsite was here till December of 1915. That is to say, there were those who resided here in nothing but tents. There were no fires. Stove was provided. One Coleman stove was provided per each tent, and 220 individuals were located in.
How cold you are right now, and you're all well dressed.
Very difficult, extremely difficult, and we find here that the number of escapes begin to increase, certainly in the period of 1915 to 1916. They preferred the possibility of escape and the possibility of being shot than having to serve in this isolated area. There's a reference to money. The prisoners of war under the Hague Convention were obliged to earn the equivalent of one shilling a day, which was equivalent to an imperial soldier's pay. These monies were, in fact, held in trust by the military district. Ration cards were provided, and canteen tickets were provided to the internees, and presumably at the end of their internment they were to collect their pay, but the documentation also shows that many of those who were in the camps were ignorant of the fact that they were obliged, or not obliged, but were entitled to such pay. And in fact, you find that there are outstanding counts at the end of the internment operations of monies that were never paid out to internment labor, in the equivalent of approximately $94,000. Current estimates of that particular monies, given compounded interest on conservative interest-bearing bonds, the equivalent is somewhere in the vicinity of $7.6 million. Again, there is an attempt by the Ukrainian-Canadian community to recoup those monies on behalf of the Ukrainian community, because in fact I'd like to simply conclude by making one observation. What is that observation? And that is, what does this entire experience tell us? Well, the entire experience tells us that, again, from the documentation from the archival records, that Ukrainians as a group were targeted for nothing less than their ethnicity. You find individuals who were naturalized and were interned simply because of their ethnicity, by the very fact that they carried a name that rang differently in the ears of the Anglo majority. What we find here is an abrogation of a social contract between the state and a segment of Canadian society. Many of these individuals were naturalized Canadians, and they, as a consequence, found it very difficult to comprehend their situation and their entire experience, but it was clearly one that was in gross violation of their civil and human rights, their civic and human rights. And I think that as a this short talk, I simply would like to point out to you that this is simply not an abnormality. This is not an anomaly, but it is clearly a case where the state abrogated its social responsibility. It targeted a community for nothing more than its ethnicity, and it happened not simply once, it's happened a series of times, and presumably can and will happen again.
У 2003 році Рада амбасадорів